Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Muslim Matters podcast, where we discuss everything under the sun that affects Muslims, such as faith, local and global politics, social media, sex education, civil rights, and family matters, all coming from a traditional Orthodox perspective. Subscribe to our podcast and follow us online on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram on our handle, Muslim Matters, and check out our site daily at muslimmatters.org.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the Muslim Matters podcast. I am your host, Zainab bint Younus, and our guest today is Eman Ahmed. Eman Ahmed is a parent educator with a background in child studies and early education. Her work focuses on teaching Muslim parents how to navigate raising Muslim children in the West today. So, jazakallah khair for joining us today, Eman.
Thank you, Zainab, for having me wa iyaki, and it's such an honor to be here and to be part of the awesome Muslim Matters community and platform.
Yeah, I'm just so excited to have you on because I first came across your work through Instagram, where you shared a lot of valuable resources, just discussions on topics like how to explain holidays like Christmas, Halloween, Valentine's Day, and not just saying like, oh, they're haram and that's the end of it, but really laying out how and why Muslim parents should be having these conversations with their kids and explaining in a really age-appropriate way, which is so valuable because we hear a lot about, oh, Muslim parents, like you need to tell your kids these things, but a lot of Muslim parents just have no clue how to have those conversations in the first place. And I know you've also recently developed content on how to discuss the LGBTQ issue, Pride Month, those kinds of things with children. And again, you have this really thorough way of laying out both the principles behind this as well as like literally a really helpful script outline that parents can adjust for kids of different ages. So tell us, like, what led you to all this work in the first place?
First of all, I'm totally blushing. Thank you. I appreciate your kind words and thank you so much for your support because I know you've been such a long, awesome supporter for this work because I've been doing it for quite a few years now to think of it. And so, yeah, my journey into focusing on educating Muslim parents and creating resources for kids kind of began with my own personal experiences and struggles as a parent. I remember when I first became a mom, I found myself constantly searching for my parenting identity. I was kind of like trying on different popular styles that never quite felt right or seemed incomplete in some way. I was always reading, researching, seeking the best way to support my kids because who doesn't want to give them the best potential, right, for their development and growth, just like, all of us. So mistakenly, I believe that the key to becoming the best parent now that I look back, like in retrospect, was outside of me rather than acquired and discovered within me. And somewhere along the path, I came across certain experiences that made me question my thoughts and beliefs. Because I think when you first become a parent, not a lot of people talk about the identity crisis you kind of go through.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Right? Between the old you and then the new you, and then what's going on and how can I make meaning from all of this? So an example is when my 3-year-old was going into this prestigious preschool and they didn't want to accommodate my request to actually help him sit when relieving himself in the bathroom. This was during his potty training journey.
Wild.
Right? And mind you, like this is a very expensive, very prestigious school. And their philosophy was all about allowing the child to make their own choices. And they thought I was absurd for teaching the kid to sit down or even requesting it. And I remember, like at that time, I was like, okay, this isn't it. This isn't it. And I have to do something about this because I ended up removing him out of that school. And then my turning point in my journey was when I went to Walmart with my 4-year-old one day, just like any regular day. And that's when he started to read. He started to read things, right? So when we walked in Walmart, he reads this big sign that says Valentine's Day. So he read it, he sounded out, and he said, "Mama, what's that?"
Oh, yep. And so it begins.
Oh no, I was not ready for that. And I remember panicking inside because I'm like, what's the fastest answer I can give and at the same time get what I need to do? get to what I need to do right now. So I panicked and I told him, oh, it's just a holiday about love. I kind of left it at that. And then he was just so confused, but I didn't do anything about it. I just ended up distracting him and I'm like, okay, let's go finish our groceries and what have you. So I remember going home that day and I started to search online. Like when the kids went to bed, I started to search online and I was like, there has to be something that explains these holidays to children, like young children, in an age appropriate way that's beyond just saying it's haram. Because I don't know about you obviously know this because you have kids as well, but Gen Alpha is like a whole new generation of like simplified answers don't work. You need to give them more. So yeah, I was looking for something that provided like some sort of a hands-on approach or an informed approach to learning about these topics, but in a way that strengthened his Islamic identity and didn't take away from it. So despite my efforts, I couldn't find any resource. I think I only stumbled upon a few blogs that were directing parents and giving them tips, but nothing that was specifically designed for kids. And at the time, I was an overworked mom, okay? I had 3 kids under the age of 4 at the time, and I was a full-time teacher. And I was like, okay, seriously, I just wanted a resource that I can print out and I can just hand over and be like, here, let's work on this weekend. But no, I couldn't find anything. And that's when I actually I was like, you know what? I'm just going to sit down one day. I'm going to, block off a few hours and I'm just going to come up with a resource for the kids. And this was just for my kids, by the way. So I made it for them. And I just shared it passively on social media, like on my Instagram. And I was like, hey guys, check this out. And then the response was just so overwhelming. And after that, many parents were asking me, can we get a copy? Are you selling this? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? So with feedback from both parents and children, because I ended up creating workbooks and then eventually it turned into workshops, I continued to improve and expand on it each year. And over time, it ended up evolving into what's now called a whole year-long program, Forming Early Foundations, that's specifically designed for parents and children who want to simplify an identity-focused approach to parenting during the early years. And so, yeah, what started from a personal need has now grown into my work's mission, basically, to provide comprehensive resources for parents and families in similar situations.
So glad that you're sharing, again, it comes from your own experience as a parent. This is not somebody who's working out of theory and has no real life experience. This is in the trenches.
Oh, yes.
And I know exactly what you mean about kids need to have solid answers because they can kind of pick up when you're trying to just shrug them off. Mm-hmm. And especially if they are in public school or they're engaging with wider society, they know something else is going on and they're going to hear other things from other kids. So it is really important to be able to lay those foundations down from an early age. Mm-hmm. And I mean, even with my daughter, she was born overseas actually, and we only ended up moving here when she was 4. And so it was now when I think back on it, I'm like, wow, it was actually a really big adjustment, even for her. And we went from living in Egypt, Kuwait, and Malaysia, which are Muslim countries. And obviously things like Christmas and Halloween and Valentine's Day just aren't things that show up very much. It wasn't something that I had to sit and have conversations with her about. And after we moved here, I had to be very conscious about pointing these things out, right? And being able to tell her hey, here, there's not Muslims everywhere around us. We're actually the minority here. So a lot of people are not going to share what we believe. And so we have to have, again, all these conversations starting from 0 and building upwards on that. So it's just a lot. It is definitely a lot. But I think it goes back to, as Muslim parents, this is our job, right? The tarbiyah of kids is literally the most important responsibility that we have. And it's not just about do you homeschool or not? And are you feeding them organic or not? This is about feeding their souls, really.
You know what I like to remind parents is that, and the reason why I even took on this project and work is because I say everything else during the early years is fleeting, right? The feeding, the potty training, the sleep training, all of that will end. But the one thing that's always gonna be remaining with your child is their identity. And it forms in the early years. That's their blueprint basically for life. So, and the unfortunate reality is that a lot of us, including myself in the beginning, I was kind of passive about it. I was like, yeah, they'll get it. They'll understand. That's it. They'll have some sort of an understanding through our day-to-day, actions and choices and stuff like that. But the reality is that it's not enough.
They can't just pick everything up from osmosis.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, in this day and age, it's just not going to work because of the fact that, like, we can't take a passive approach to building their identity and nurturing it, mainly because of the technology, the world of technology we're living in, right? I think our parents definitely had similar challenges when we were growing up. I mean, we were told Christmas was haram. I don't know about you, but that's what my mom said. And I remember during the parades, she'd be like, "You're not going to school today." And I was cool with that. But we didn't have the internet. I mean, we did have the internet, but it wasn't as accessible.
And there was no social media back then.
There was no social media, exactly. And it wasn't everywhere. I don't know if you can remember, like, these thoughts and ideologies are literally embedded everywhere. And you know how you were saying your daughter was in Malaysia at one point, and then things were more pronounced when you went to America, is it? Like when you guys...
Canada. Yeah, coming back to Canada.
Canada, sorry, there you go. It's no longer a North American thing, though. It's global. Because we've been traveling recently, and my kids have been seeing like Christmas and other themes in Muslim countries. Yeah. So at that point, I was so grateful for the work we've done previously while we were in North America, because I'm like, okay, now they have that foundation. So my kids are now able, and I've seen this, I'm going to keep going back and forth, but the idea is that when I started teaching them about mainstream holidays, they were all like 4 and 5-ish. And we were doing this every single year. We were increasing their comprehension every single year. And now they're at a point where they're 8 and 10, and they just have such a solid understanding, not just in terms of the history and all of that, but they fundamentally understand why this is wrong. And so now even if we're traveling and they see Christmas, they know exactly what's going on in there, right? They'll tell me, "Oh, mama, this is a form of shirk and this is wrong. And, they're breaking the second rule of Tawheed and all of that good stuff." And I was like, that's the kind of understanding they need to have in this day and age. It's the whole it's haram will not cut it anymore.
It has to be tied back to something deeper and something more meaningful that is underscoring our entire lives, which, as you mentioned, is Tawheed.
Exactly. But you know what's sad, Zainab? Not a lot of adults don't have Tawheed and Aqidah as their main priority when it comes
I completely agree. Yeah.
Right? When it comes to learning their religion, unfortunately. Like, we might focus on things like Salah and different pillars, but not necessarily when it comes to what the Shahada even means. And how does it look like? How does it look to implement the testimony of faith every single day? Because that's a choice you're making every single day.
I'm really glad you brought that up and you highlighted that, because it is what underscores all of this, right? It's what underscores our purpose for being. It underscores our marriages, our children, our children's lives, all of that. And as you said, like, because so many people aren't connected to it or have a deeper understanding of it, they aren't equipped to have these conversations at a deeper level. And in fact, I would argue that because of that lack of understanding, a lot of parents themselves don't understand the importance of having these conversations in the first place. Like, I am sure you've come across feedback where the idea that, like, "Oh, why are you teaching your children to be so different from everybody else? Why are you trying to isolate them from wider society? Oh, they're not going to love Islam anymore because you're pushing them away from everything. Oh, this is harmless." So how do you kind of discuss that and address that? I'm just really interested because I help teach a madrasa with kids, right? And so we, every single year, same thing, we have these conversations with the kids. And the really sad part is when, we'll be explaining to them, like, obviously, again, the foundation of Tawheed, and then, like, why this is wrong. So Christmas, for example, right? Or even something like birthdays. And I know there's a difference of opinion on that. We personally take the opinion it's not permissible. And again, going into, like, the origins of it and beliefs around it, things like that. And so sometimes the kids themselves will be like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." And they'll go home and they'll tell their parents. And then they'll come back and be like, "Oh, my mom says it's not a big deal and it's okay for us to take pictures with the mall Santa because it's just for fun." And then you're like, why would a Muslim parent, like, actively undermine any of this, And it's very much, like, I see it, and I grew up in the West, as very much an issue of, like, kind of an inferiority complex and, their own feelings of being left out when they were a kid and they didn't have an understanding back then either. Like, their parents didn't explain to them, like, why anything was wrong. So now when they have their kids, they're kind of living vicariously through them.
They are. That's exactly what I was going to say.
So yeah, like, what's your take? How do you answer this, basically?
Well, the reality is, just goes back to the priorities and the values and the principles of the parent. That's a battle you rarely can fight. If a parent, doesn't see it as a problem, then I struggled with this, and I've been doing this for years. Maybe some parents are like open-minded in terms of understanding, okay, why this is actually harmful. They're willing to listen. And then there are parents who are not willing to listen or keep an open mind about it. And like you said, a lot of parents are living their childhood through their kids. They want to, and I've had these conversations firsthand with some parents where they told me like they were deprived of everything and they ended up doing things behind their parents' back. And so they don't want to repeat the same cycle kind of thing. And that's when I try to get them to understand that they are approaching the whole thing the wrong way. It's not so much about here's what I was deprived of and now I'm going to allow my kids. And I'm like, okay, well, what will the outcome look like? Now that you've given your child these experiences, what's the outcome? And sometimes that gets them to pause, right? Okay, you gave them the experiences, now what? So what are you going to do tomorrow? And I don't know if you remember, I talk about this even with Valentine's Day. I said, okay, you're okay with your child. There's nothing wrong with love. It is a beautiful holiday. Love is a beautiful thing to be celebrated. I would say, well, what's the outcome? What are you going to say when your teenager brings a boyfriend or a girlfriend? Right? Exactly. What are you going to say? I mean, that kid is going to look straight at you and be like, well, I went to the school party of Valentine's Day. Why is it wrong now? So I always remind parents, like, you have to start making the choices for them now, you know, so that they can actually continue kind of like the legacy or the path that you've set for them. And that's not always guaranteed. That's not right. We all know this. Nothing is guaranteed in parenthood. Even if we were the most perfect parents and we've done everything right, even from a religious point of view, we still can't guarantee a positive outcome. And I think the problem is, Zainab, it comes back to how we view parenthood. A lot of parents feel like it's their job to produce good kids. And I always say you're not a parent so that you can end up having good kids. You're a parent because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put you in this position, right? You're making these choices not so that, you know, your kid is going to turn out righteous. I mean, we don't know that, but you're doing it so that in the eyes of Allah, you've done what you were supposed to do. And then the outcome was never in your hands. You leave that up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's where dua comes in. You put your best foot forward. You know, you stop your kids from going to these events for the sake of Allah. It is a sacrifice. Who's to say it's not a sacrifice? And that's the second part that I wanted to talk about is it's not supposed to be easy, you know, and that's an excuse some parents make. It's like, oh, but it's easy for you. And I'm like, but why? Who doesn't want to go to a Christmas party and get some cool gifts, you know? But you sacrifice that desire. That desire is there, sure. But you sacrifice it and you say, no, I'm going to put Allah first. And I'm going to, you know, I'm not going to go to that Christmas party and I'm not going to send my kids so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can accept this, you know, sacrifice from me. At the end of the day, this kind of work is not meant to be easy. This is it kind of goes along the lines of doing anything else within the religion. There's a lot of sacrifices we make in parenthood, and this is just one of them.
That's a really great framing of parenthood in and of itself, because as you said, a lot of people, you know, we become parents without necessarily thinking about what that means for us and for our akhirah, and on multiple levels too. As you said, like nobody talks about what does it mean to transition from being, you know, single to married to now you have kids, or like one kid versus 3 kids, for example. Like that's a massive difference. And having, I don't want to say necessarily an articulate like parenting philosophy the way that a lot of the parenting mommy groups kind of push. Like I never sat and I'd be like, I am going to be this kind of parent in line with this particular philosophy. Like we don't need to be doing that, but we do need to think about what it means for us as Muslims. Like what does being a parent mean within an Islamic context? What does that mean in terms of our spiritual relationship with Allah? And I think some very simple examples to point to are like, okay, for example, as mothers, we know a mother's dua is almost always accepted, right? So what does that mean for us? Like, are we making the right du'as for our kids? Are we prioritizing dua for our kids, for their akhirah, and not just, oh Allah, make them smart and let them get an Ivy League education and make $1 bazillion.
Exactly.
Or whatever, you know? But really, really about their development as Muslims. And I think this starts like, it should start from the womb, you know, like as parents, as mothers and fathers. I really want to emphasize this too. It's not just about the moms, it's about the dads too, because you can't, or not that you can't, but having both parents on the same page is just such an important part of this entire process. And both parents need to know what they're doing. You can't just expect one parent to be doing all the Islamic parenting stuff and then the other parent's like, hey, let's go trick-or-treating.
Yeah.
That sends a lot of really mixed messages. That's a massive challenge. I know some people do go through that.
Yeah.
But it comes back to, again, when you are getting married, when you're thinking about like having a family, are you guys on the same page? Do you guys share the same values and ideas when it comes to how you want to prioritize raising your kids?
I think that requires a whole different episode because I know a lot of parents struggle with that. Co-parenting and Islamic parenting, that's a difficult one. I know that firsthand. But the thing is, one of the things that I help parents with this idea of like being on the same page, I always remind them that it doesn't have to be complicated, right? So your values are rooted within the Quran and Sunnah. And I like to give them the analogy of the framing, the structure of your home, like the framing of your home. That's your values. But a lot of us just stop there, right? It's kind of like, oh, we know to follow the Sunnah, right? We value the footsteps of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the things we don't ask ourselves is, how does this look in action, in practicality? Like, how does this look every single day? So I like to give them the example of thinking of the bricks of your home like your daily routines. And your daily routines are an implementation of the values that you uphold. So an example is like, let's say you want to take your child to a haircut. You do this on a monthly basis. This is a monthly household routine. But you and your husband, you and your spouse, or the caregivers in the home, you all value the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so you know, the whole family knows that you're not going to go and get a cool mohawk, right, for your child, because what do you know? You know that the Prophet ﷺ forbade this, and he told the little boy who he saw, with the half shaven head, to shave it or leave it. To shave it all or leave it all. So that's what it looks like to make those small choices every single day. It doesn't have to be this big chunk. Like, when people think of Islamic parenting or Islamic knowledge, they think it's like this massive thing that they have to acquire. Like, it's too big, it's too overwhelming. I don't know where to start. And I think our job as educators now, or people in the field, is to really simplify things in a way that makes sense for the modern family today. I think that's where a lot of families are struggling, how to make Islam and Islamic parenthood practical on a day-to-day basis.
Very much so. I love that. Again, making it practical on a day-to-day basis, and it's not actually as overwhelming as we think. We don't need to be sheikhs and sheikhas to be able to raise our kids right,
Exactly.
So kind of on that note, like, what do you think are some of the most difficult challenges for Muslim parents today? And I know we've kind of mentioned like the holidays thing, but that's not the only issue, right? It's more about the challenges that we are facing in terms of fundamental principles, like worldviews, outlook, ideas that are just like so widespread. And, maybe Muslim parents just like themselves are struggling to understand what these ideas are. So like, what do you think really are like those top most difficult challenges?
Wow, that's an amazing question. It's a loaded question, but I think the challenges faced by Muslim families today are diverse. First of all, they're multifaceted. We cannot say they look a certain way. They do depend on many factors, right? We're thinking about family dynamics, region of living, social, economic status, and so forth. But I do think that ultimately the biggest challenge for Muslim parents in particular is navigating the delicate balance between preserving those Islamic values and cultural traditions. That also plays a big role, right? While raising our children in a modern and rapidly changing world. And I think this is just a common theme that we're all facing globally, right? Muslim parents, there's this expectation that Muslim parents should be instilling strong religious foundations for their kids and beliefs and good, moral values, all while ensuring that they are equipped to thrive and succeed in their respective societies. And we're supposed to do all of this with minimal help.
Yeah, we don't have the village anymore, most of us.
There's no village and there's nobody out there helping us. As we're seeing like living costs are increasing. Now, if you think about it, majority of households are multi-income households, right? So if both parents are overworked and they're overtired and they're overwhelmed, what can we expect of them, right? So they are going to be leaning on to other facilities and educational systems. And I think, and those systems, as we all know, they're flawed no matter where you live. And not a lot of people, can afford home educating or homeschooling, again, because of the variable factors that are out there. But among other challenges on a macro level, I believe, is the new age of environment, right? Of free speech and spirituality over religion and self-worship that all contradict our Islamic identity, right? And faith. And although these challenges, like I said before, I think they always existed. Like when I talk to my mom, she shares similar challenges. But I think the difference, and I tell her now, is that we're facing this on a much faster and larger scale. And so what other challenges I can think of? Oh, yes, of course, the accessibility of digital media, right? Social platforms, entertainment. Yes, and they're all not only accessible to kids, but they're exposing children, as you all know, based on all these hidden agendas to conflicting values and ideologies that contradict the Islamic teaching.
And they're targeting specifically, like whether we're talking about, political ideologies or just the capitalist aspect of it, right? Because in their eyes, every single one of our children is a consumer. And it's not like, we're waiting until they're adults. No. They are consumers now because, we have our credit card information logged into our phones and we have like apps and stuff. The kids are like hitting upgrade on certain things or unlocking new levels of that credit card if you don't have your settings right. So the kids are already consumers from the age of 3-4 years old now?
Oh, younger Zainab, from infancy.
I feel like out of touch now.
Yeah, it's great. Like think of Coco Melon. Coco Melon is one of the highest earning YouTube platforms.
Oh, that's wild.
Highest. I don't know how many million they're at right now. So, and who is Coco Melon designed for? Infants and children from literally 0 years old, because you will hear parents who will put their kid in front of their 4-month-old or whatever. We're not judging here, but I'm just saying they are designed. These videos are designed to captivate their eyes. So this is a huge, huge problem that we're facing, right? When it comes to digital media and social media is a beast of its own, on its own. And how do we are we even going to conquer it? I don't know. How are we going to navigate it? That's new territory for us because now we know that, before it was like, don't be on social media. But now we're seeing all these Gen Zers and young teenagers who are creating accounts behind their backs, right? Looking at school and what have you. So I think the conversation then becomes, okay, well, how can we empower our kids to make the right choices?
Yeah.
When it comes to social use.
We can't control their actions, but what we can lay the foundation for is influencing them so that when they are making those decisions, they're making the better decision. Maybe they're not always going to make the right decision. They're not always going to be perfect, of course. They're going to make mistakes because they're kids. But do they have the tarbiyah established that, that little voice in their hearts and their heads goes, it's not even about my mom's going to find out. It's, Allah knows. And am I okay with this? And
the thing, here's the thing. I love that. But I do think that some parents start that too early. For a child to get to on a cognitive level, to stop him or herself from taking an action because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching, that's a beautiful thing and that is the hope. But at a certain point, especially when they're very young, you have to make those choices for them. So you're the one who's turning off the YouTube channels and you're the one who's not allowing certain channels or not allowing, watching certain things. You're not making it accessible. When your child gets to a point where they're going to say, I shouldn't be watching this, you're looking at around the preteen age, right? That's when it's starting to develop. That's when they're really practicing their values in an autonomous way. But prior to that, I'm such
that's on us
to shut it down. This is a yes and this is a no, and that's what we're going to follow. And so but the thing is, you have to be disciplined first and foremost. You see, a lot of parents are going to say, well, I do this for my kids where I don't allow them to watch such and such shows or this and that. But if you're always on your phone and you're doing the exact opposite,
what message is
there's a gap. Yeah. Right? Kids who see their parents do that are more prone to do things behind their parents' back because they feel like they're just fronting, right? It's like, you're not even doing it. Why are you telling me to do it? So if you're really that's the hard part of being a parent.
Right? The alignment of values and practice. And sometimes you're like, I just want to take a break for myself. But there's no really taking breaks in front of your kids.
There's no taking breaks. And I always say, listen, you deserve your mental health break. If you're going to do it, go find somewhere or they can't wait to see you, or wait till they go to sleep, depending whatever your rules are at your home, depending on the rules. But it's so, so important to model what we say. We can't just be preaching to the choir. Like, we have to be able to, first and foremost, let our modeling do the teaching.
That's so huge. That's so huge. And I think again, that's another Quranic principle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, Allah actually asks us and points to those who, they tell people to do one thing, but they do something else entirely. And it's literally like, why do you do this?
Mm-hmm.
And that actually holds severe spiritual consequences once it reaches a certain point, right? And that is something that we need to be very cognizant of, first and foremost, within ourselves. And then when it comes to things like parenting, for sure.
Right. And then I think another big challenge that comes up a lot within, my circles is the religion over culture. Because that's even with mainstream holidays, culture comes up, especially sometimes from our revert friends as well. So the thing is, religion over culture is, I think, really, really hard to implement. But then we kind of have to lean on the fact that, like, we want to raise our kids with a strong Islamic identity amidst the cultural diversity we're living in, because as much as it can be a challenge, there is no way we can say culture, because this is the message sometimes children get, right? Culture is equally important as religion. Especially if you come from a background, especially, like, I don't know, but if you're I'm
Desi, so I totally get it.
Okay, so if you're Arab, for example, that's another thing, right? Culture and religion is kind of sometimes mishmashed.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
And nobody knows what's the difference between culture and religion.
And culture is passed off as religion in so many ways, too.
Yeah. And I'm telling you, like, this is such a slippery slope. And I like to remind parents to make a clear distinction, especially during the early years, between what's culture and what's religion, and which one do you always prioritize? Which one comes first? And so if you're leading with Islam always, what's going to happen is your child is going to understand that any culture, not just their own culture, any culture, even if it comes to the Western culture or the environment that they're living in, they're going to know it's going to always be secondary to Islam. And I think that distinction is so important, because I also know, as parents, also struggle with this. So we struggle with prioritizing Islam in certain aspects of our lives. And I think that's just the beauty of being a believer, right? We're not supposed to be showing up, perfectly. We are going to be leading an imperfect life, but the goal is to always come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ask ourselves, okay, I slipped up. What did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about this? What did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say about this? Let me go learn it, and now let me do better. Because that's, I feel like, another stigma with Islamic parenting. Like, there's this expectation that you're supposed to show up every single day, like perfectly polished. I'm doing all the right choices. And it's
not works in progress, like, as individuals, as believers, let alone as parents. I think that's important to point out as well, like making space for that and just reassuring everybody that, again, none of us are perfect parents, and we are always learning new things, or we should be. And I think that's something that you do such a great job of, is providing the information and the education, because as parents, we're always learning how to parent better as well, And I think this is probably especially true for parents of more than one child, where it's like, your first kid is the one that you're like, either you're winging it or you're like overly prepared.
Yeah.
Right?
That's so true.
And then you get your other kid, and now you have like a whole different perspective on things, like anything from like breastfeeding to the potty training to just like understanding how exhausting it is just having a child. And then you adjust accordingly. When you know better, you're going to adjust for that. When you have a different experience entirely, you're going to have to eventually realize that you've got to be flexible enough to accommodate like this entirely different new kid, because very few people's children are like cookie cutter images of each other. You're gonna have like one kid who's like super chill, and the other kid like just needs a lot more hands-on attention. So how are you gonna handle that, right?
Exactly. And I think that our kids need to see that. They don't want to see a perfect version of us. Who wants that? Nobody wants perfection, because it's not attainable. But our kids need to see our whole selves, and our kids need to see us do something wrong and fix our mistakes. They need to see, one thing I also love to remind parents is that we tend to focus so much on not making a mistake and not sinning. And we end up, which obviously we should be doing, right? That is the goal. But then we end up with adults later in life who feel paralyzed by their, misactions or their sins.
Yeah.
And it's so unfortunate. And I think the reason for that is because from an early age, we put so much emphasis on not sinning that we totally forgot to put the emphasis on Tawbah, on
Yes,
how
and
to
what
repent.
that looks like and how to live it.
That does, you know what? How many people don't know how to repent? Like, there are a lot of people who are clueless on the steps to repentance and Tawbah and what does that look like, and the fact that there's hope, because there was so much judgment on the actual sin. And I feel like us as a generation, as parents in this generation, I believe that it's our goal to teach our kids, to equally teach them, yes, we're not sinning, but we're also very much susceptible to sinning. And so we have to learn, obviously, how to put appropriate preventative measures. But if we slip, it's okay, as long as we get right back up and we say, Ya Allah, tubtu ilayk, I came back to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's part of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that He knows we're going to sin and He knows we're going to make mistakes. And that's why He loves those who keep coming back to Him. So my goal personally is to really change that narrative, because I also grew up with the whole concept of don't sin and how dare you sin. And if you sin, you're destroyed.
Destroyed forever.
There's no hope for you. And I'm like, no, I'm changing that, because I also became that adult later on who really struggled with the shame that came with sinning, which of course we should have that sense of shame, but not to a point where it's paralyzing us from doing Tawbah, right?
Yes, absolutely.
That's when it becomes harmful. So alhamdulillah, I think it's just this whole concept of, parenting our kids from an Islamic perspective it's a lifelong journey, and it's going to be a journey full of mistakes. But like I said, we are always emphasizing going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and centering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our parenthood, not in so-and-so's parenting style and not in conscious parenting and this kind of parenting, which I am totally guilty of. I tried all of those. Okay. And then I was like, no, I'm not putting myself in a box.
Yep.
This is not meant for me, because at the end of the day, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who gave us these kids, and we have a big responsibility in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fulfill this huge, huge sense of responsibility to teach our kids about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's essentially our objective as parents. It's literally just that. No matter what you feed them, right? Or no matter how you sleep train them, that's not really the point. The point is for that child to know his creator. And if you've done that part, then alhamdulillah, you have succeeded, inshallah.
You do such a great job of laying all this out, mashallah. So on that note, just before we wrap up, I'd like to conclude this with what are your top tips for Muslim parents to keep in mind for establishing and upholding Islamic values, and especially with younger children? I know you have covered so much of it during this discussion already, but just kind of I don't know, top 3, top 5, whatever you've got for us.
No problem. My first and foremost, and this is the tip I'm going to give you, because this is what I have done for myself, is I started with myself, right? So you want to begin with yourself. You look in the mirror and you ask yourself the hard questions that are like, are you aligned with your own Islamic identity? Are your intentions in the right place of raising your children for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And are you working towards fulfilling your obligations towards Allah? The second one being reevaluate and revisit your values and principles and do that every single day. It's not just, people think about values and principles and they think it's like a New Year's resolution thing. It's like, as long as I do it once a year. No, you can revisit it and reevaluate it every single day. You have to ask yourself the questions: are they rooted in religion and in the Quran and Sunnah? Are they practiced on the daily? The third tip I can give is to maintain the right perspective. Your child's identity development begins from when they are born. Okay, not when they're teenagers, not when they're adults or young adults, from when they're born. And so being passive about their identity upbringing in this day and age specifically will absolutely do a disservice to your child in the long run. But we're so grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, because Allah already gave us a head start. I love to remind parents that Allah already put the fitrah in this child. And as the Prophet ﷺ reminded us, it's the parents who either make him Jew or Christian or a fire worshiper. So that shows you the power you have as a parent. You are the leader of this fitrah. And then to simplify things, if we want to make it super simple and we want to say, take an active approach to your child's religious identity, some examples can look like this. Like if we want to practice this, let's break it down into age groups. So from 0 to 3, you're teaching your child through your own modeling and parenting choices, right? So you're making those right choices for them based on the Quran and Sunnah. And during this time, that's when I like to tell parents to focus on their own healing and Islamic education. This is the best time to, take that online course, to take a halaqah if you need to, because they're still very young and you're making the choices for them right now, right? And what that's going to do, it's going to align your care choices for your child in terms of like how you dress them and how you feed them and so forth. And then from the ages of 4 to 6, you're teaching them prophetic manners, behaviors, and core Islamic concepts through play and storytelling. All right. So this is not the time in which we're lecturing our kids. Islam isn't like a subject you're teaching at this point.
Right.
You're still modeling it. Right. Yeah. So I always like to think of it this way. I always tell kids, Islam is who you are. It's not what you learn or do. I mean, you're learning it, but if you embrace it as your identity, it becomes just a lot easier to implement. And then from 7 onward, that's when you're beginning the formal Islamic education. And obviously it starts with Salah. If you can do this previous to that, that's even better. But that's when you're really focusing on that formal education. And the best approach is to do it together. I know it's so much easier and sometimes it's feasible to send our kids to, Sunday school or an Islamic school, and that's great. But you have to continue at home. The problem is
not be completely outsourced. I say this as a parent and as a madrasa teacher. So I've got both perspectives there.
Absolutely. You can't, there has to be a continuum. There has to be an extension. And the thing is, maybe I'm not going to get into this right now, but this is usually where a lot of parents and children, this is the gap that exists, right? So even if you send them to Islamic school and nothing is implemented at home or nothing is even revised or, understood at home, then that kid has totally forgotten what he's learned at school. So continue the formal education at home and do it together. And I always love to turn it into like a family affair. It doesn't have to be like, it can be a family bonding time where you just sit there and ask each other questions and increase your knowledge that way. And I think this is also a very critical time to increase your child's critical thinking skills, especially in regards to things they see. So this is when you're having those discussions of mainstream holidays. If any pride ideology comes up in a show or something that they watched or something that they witnessed, this is when it's appropriate to have those kind of discussions. And the thing is, remember that like upholding our Islamic values will always come at a price, and you'll always have to sacrifice something. That's why it's so important. Yeah. And I think it's so important to find, like, this is the piece that sometimes can be missing. I know we live in a hyper individualistic society, but it's important to find support from like-minded families, friends, mentors, coaches, communities, whatever it is. Lean on them. And most importantly, seek the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a contagious nature of being around like-minded people who have the same goal and mission as you, right? And
definitely.
Right? Yeah. And one thing I just love to remind parents, like, stop doing this work alone. Don't do it in isolation. Find your people, because you're going against the current and you need people who are going to help you.
You need the support that will provide, I don't say just like the emotional support, but they will help reinforce those values. And I can say that as an example for myself, when I was growing up, like, I didn't have many friends my age, but the Islamic center that we went to, my mom had a lot of really great friends of varying backgrounds, and a lot of them were converts actually. And just being around these aunties who were just like so kind and loving and fun, and they would like connect with me. And so they didn't need to sit and lecture me about anything. It was just being around them was, especially as a tween, it was a great sense of, it's not just my parents telling me to be Muslim and live this way. I was literally witnessing people who had chosen Islam for themselves, right? And they would talk about why, and it wouldn't be in a lecturing way. They would just be sharing stories like, oh yeah, in Jahiliyyah this, but now in Islam this, right? And it really, really helped reinforce these messages. And I probably didn't even really appreciate it until I became an adult myself. But the influence of being surrounded by people who share these values is like, we cannot underestimate it. It is so powerful. It's indelible, but it is like a strong emotional seed. And for my parents themselves, like, my mom didn't have to worry about, like, if I was hanging out with Auntie so-and-so, that I was going to be exposed to something wrong because, we already knew that they share the same values.
And that is so, so important, because at a certain point, your child is going to start looking outside. Right. They're going to look outward, and they're going to look at the external environment to see who's implementing these values and who isn't. So if you have that community, and good job to your mom, mashallah, tabarakallah, like if you give them that sense of community from that age, then you're only going to give them the best developmental opportunity to strengthen their self-identity overall.
Well, Jazakallah khair for all of this incredible wisdom. I appreciate it so much, because even though my daughter's 13 now, so I feel like, we've kind of went through those bumps of the early years and laying those foundations, alhamdulillah, but there's still like a lot to go. And everything that you've mentioned is not just for when the kids are little, but as they're growing older as well. It's just a continuation of that process. It's a continuation of having those discussions. And actually, I want to make a point too, that for plenty of families who maybe they're only just now coming back to the deen, maybe now they're reevaluating their parenting philosophy, their values, how they want to practice Islam inside the house. It's not like, oh, well, you missed the window, that's it.
No.
Sucks to be you. There's always hope. There is always a place for change, and having those conversations with kids at these different stages is still important. Like, literally just being really honest and being like, hey, like, we are changing now. We are pivoting here. We are refocusing ourselves as a family on Islam, on Allah, and this is why. And, just being really honest, even when, especially for like older kids, and being like, hey, yeah, when I was younger, in the last few years, we didn't prioritize Islam as much. Maybe we just didn't know, and now we are learning, and now we want to change for the better and incorporate these things. Or maybe we started off with one track and then we slipped over the years, and now we're realizing that, our akhirah really matters and we want to change things for the better. So this is why we're doing this now. So again, it's not a hopeless situation if you didn't start off perfectly from the beginning.
No.
You can always start making that change today. And
yes. There's no expiry date to this, right? It's like I said, it's a lifelong journey. And no matter when you come onto this journey, you just begin there. You say Bismillah and you get started there. And that's what I love to tell parents. Like, parents who sometimes come to me and they feel guilty. Like, I haven't done this during the early years, so now what do I do? And I always say, listen, make dua and just take the first step and start somewhere. Anywhere, just pick one step and move forward and say, Ya Allah, help me with the rest. And your story, as you were speaking, you were reminding me of my mother, because my mother wasn't always religious and she wasn't always practicing. And maybe someone who's listening to this can feel inspired, because she started practicing after her, seventh child?
wow,
So I just want to share with you guys, it's never too late. It's never too late. Yeah. Well, I'm named Eman because she felt the Eman when she had me. So I'm the eighth kid. Yeah. And I'm the eighth kid. So that just goes to show you, like, through all those years of parenthood, my mom wasn't practicing. She wasn't wearing a hijab. And today, if you meet her, you would never think that. There was no way you would say this person was not religious. She just started somewhere. And I remember her story was that she's just started with the hijab. She started to wear the hijab, and slowly but surely, she just took that first step. And subhanAllah, there's something about, when you do tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you say, Ya Allah, guide my way, Allah will just facilitate the rest. Like, she till now doesn't even know how it all happened, but it just happened, But she just started with the hijab. That was her first parenting choice. And here's the funny catch. She didn't even tell, like, right away. She didn't tell her daughters to wear the hijab right away. And her daughters were teenagers at the time. So she didn't even tell them to wear it or anything. She started with herself. She started wearing it. And the girls were then observing what was happening. And that's when they started to ask questions. So always begin with yourself. Put your trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and just start anywhere.
That is so powerful and so beautiful. And it's the perfect note to end on. So jazakallah khair just for sharing all of this wisdom. It's so practical. It's so applicable. It's not just abstract theory. This is the real world and you're in the trenches. And I love that you are sharing your experience with us so that we can all benefit.
Jazakallah khair, and I appreciate you, Zainab, and thank you for having me.
So may Allah bless you, your family, your work, and guide us all to being better parents and grant us that strength and ability to take these steps and do the right things. Ameen.
Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Ameen ya Rabb. Jazakallah khair.
To our listeners, thank you as always for tuning in, and I pray that this was as beneficial for you as it was for me. Don't forget to share your own thoughts and your feedback, your own parenting stories and inspirational anecdotes, and let us know how you enjoy this episode. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Hey everyone, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us online on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram on our handle Muslim Matters. And check out our site daily at muslimmatters.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.